everyone. My name is Juanita Irizarry, or Juanita Irizarry, whichever one you can pronounce. Executive Director of Friends of the Parks. We are so excited that so many people are interested in this topic about Morgan Shoal and Shipwreck and the site of Pebble Beach. And I keep saying to Jen, I'm from Hyde Park, and so Morgan Shoal didn't have a lot of meaning to me. Pebble Beach didn't have a lot of meaning to me. And so this is a great opportunity to educate folks, whether you live nearby or somewhere throughout any part of the city, to learn about Morgan Shoal and some of the efforts that local advocates have going on along that part of the lakefront. So I'm just going to learn along with many of you, and I'm going to hand everything over to Jen Kilgore, our Deputy Director, who has been working with lots of partners on the ground around this issue. So thanks for being here, everybody. Jen, take it away.
Great. So again, very excited to see so many people showing up for this event. We have a wonderful panel of speakers. Just want to give a little bit of context. Our Netsch lectures are in honor of Walter Netsch, who was, in addition to a world-renowned architect, served as the president of the Park District in the late 80s. He responded to Mayor Harold Washington's call for reforming the Park District from a patronage system to a more professional agency, more responsive to the needs of Chicagoans, and we honor his work by bringing together thinkers, policymakers, community activists, all ranges of perspectives to help us explore the complex and really important issues affecting our parks and public spaces. And this year's lectures are devoted to the topic of lakeshore erosion, particularly urgent because of climate change, because of the increased storm surges, fluctuating lake levels. I even learned at a previous lecture where we had representatives from CDOT talking about expanding Oak Park beach as a protective force, using beaches as a nature-based solution to erosion. I learned that even the fact that our waters are warmer now and we have less ice protection, that even becomes a threat because in the winter, now the waves come in more. So there's just so many different ways that climate change is affecting the safety of our shoreline, which affects our homes, our recreation abilities, our Pebble Lakeshore Drive, many reasons for us to be concerned about lakeshore erosion. And also the Army Corps of Engineers is currently doing a reevaluation report to see what measures we might use to protect our shoreline. And we are mobilizing folks and trying to inspire people to say, hey, let's have nature-based solutions. Let's have soft solutions to our shoreline instead of just relying on concrete. And in the meantime, that also provides opportunities to perhaps increase green space, perhaps to complete our parks and path system. For those of you who are familiar with our last 4 miles vision, to complete the park system at the last 2 miles of the north end and the last 2 miles to the south end. But I don't want to take too much time on that because that's something we can get into during this discussion if there's space and time. The reason we picked Morgan Shoal to focus on today is, number one, it's just really, really interesting. You got geology, history, you got the natural lake bed, you got the story of a ship, we've got biology. So it's really interesting topics. I hope you'll agree. Also, I think it's really illuminating for big picture questions around the interplay between the human impact and imprint on our lakeshore and nature and that dance that we have, because we don't really have a natural lakeshore. As many of us know, it's landfill. And so it's a very interesting story, and the Morgan Shoal area definitely shines a light on the whole conversation we can have about our lakefront. And it's also timely. I want to give a shout out to advocates from Morgan Shoal, many of whom are in the Zoom room with us today, who have been trying to figure out what is the status of, what is happening with this section of the lakefront. But I will leave that conversation for later because I do not want to delay getting to our amazing guest speakers. So give me a moment while I share my screen again. So we have Patricia, or some folks know her, Trish Morse, the author of a column in the Herald, Hyde Park Stories. She's a historian, knows a lot about the area. We've got Phil Willink, who's a biologist and who did this incredible mapping project of the underwater ecosystem. Again, I'll let him speak to his amazing work. And then we also have Bill Swislow. Some of you who may have met at we did a walk. He led a walk with us. Wow, seems so long ago, up on Foster Beach, who can speak to the art and the culture that many people aren't aware of along our lakefront. And so without further ado, unless anyone has any questions before I turn it over to our amazing speakers. I have different screens open, but I'm making sure I'm watching the chat here. Okay, awesome. Well, Trish, do you want to take it away? Oh, and let me.
Okay, now I'm unmuted.
Yeah, there we go.
Oops. Let me shrink this down. Oops. There. Okay, so I am starting on the wrong slide. There we go. So I'm going to cover 200 years of history in 15 minutes. So this is going to be flying, so I'm sure there'll be some questions, but at least it's an overview of how we got to where we are today. So first of all, Morgan. Morgan is James Morgan. He came with his father. He was a teenager, and he came with his father to Chicago area in the 1840s. They were wealthy and the British, and the father wanted to be a cattle rancher. So he bought 3,000 acres southwest of what was then Chicago, played around with his cattle ranch, got sick of it and sold it to a developer who named it Morgan Park. So these are the Morgans of Morgan Park. James Morgan, as a young man, got together with two other guys, and they decided to become lumber barons. So they bought a hunk of Michigan. They started cutting down the white pine forest, turning it into lumber, shipping it on schooners to Chicago. And as his obituary said, one of those men enriched by the magic growth of Chicago. So they had wharves down on the south branch of the Chicago River, which was really lucky because when the fire came along in 1871, it started north of them and moved north. So they had lumber ready to go when Chicago really needed to build. But he was unlucky in that his house burned. So he moves to Hyde Park. He buys a bunch of land. He builds a house at what we would now call 5200 Hyde Park Boulevard. And he builds a pier. And a lot of the narrative here is that he wanted to build land. But I actually think what he was doing was building this harbor. So he buys a hunk of sand and sticks a pier out. And the way the currents work coming around the shoal is they dump sand. So as soon as you block it, you get sand. But what it does is erode the sand on the south side. So he gets this little harbor going. He dredges it out. He has some rowboats. He has a steam tug, So he's playing around, commuting downtown on the IC, on the Illinois Central, until 1891, when you have the World's Fair and everybody's trying to cash in. So he leases the land he's created with his pier, which is now 8 acres, to the Chicago Beach Hotel, and then he joins the board. So he's making money 2 different ways off the Chicago Beach Hotel, which is wildly lucrative. It's the luxury hotel during the fair. And the vision you always see of this, the first Chicago Beach Hotel, is the way it looks when you look at it from the south. This is the north side. So this is where the beach is. This is where the ballroom is. You can see these poor ladies are getting windblown out on the pier. This is facing Morgan Shoal. So that's how it gets its name. It's Morgan. So the blue thing is indicating Morgan Shoal. It's actually part of a whole network of these petrified, fossilized coral reefs from the Silurian, I believe. The one that's really a ship killer is actually out here, a number of miles off 55th Street, called Hyde Park Reef. And it's in the late 19th century. It's taking out ore boats, it's taking out coal boats. They're heading down to the steel mills. But with time, the boats are bigger and they're sailing further out into the lake. And of course, there's more freight on trains. So memory of these reefs seems to disappear by the time you get to our monument to Chicago's nautical history, which is, of course, the Silver Spray. So the Silver Spray is just an excursion boat, and it's coming out from Chicago Harbor. It's sailing straight down to hit the 59th Street Pier, where 200 University of Chicago students are standing waiting to go to Gary. And of course, what it does is it hits Morgan Shoal. This is the Silver Spray. Started life as Bloomer Girl, which I'm kind of sorry it changed its name. And as you can see, it's just an excursion boat. It, may not have had the best captain. 2 years earlier, he crashes the Silver Spray into another excursion boat, injuring a number of people. So anyway, he does not seem to know that there are these reefs. He thinks it's a sandbar. So when he runs aground, he thinks he can get towed off. So he waits for the tow. He's of course, the captain is responsible for staying with the ship. Boats come, they pull, and it doesn't budge because, of course, it's not on sand. It gets to be dark, so they go on shore. Then they come back the next day and they think, oh, we'll make it float higher. We'll take all the coal off. So they took off 20 tons of coal, and it rolls over because it gets top heavy. And the storm is coming in and it busts it apart. So the boiler drops through the hole down into the reef. The top infrastructure floats off and ends up down in Jackson Park. And the storm breaks apart the hull and it ends up on shore. So that's the sober version that appeared in the Chicago Tribune. If you Google the Silver Spray wreck, you'll quite often find the silly version, which was published in this newspaper. And you can see, the accident happened right by the Chicago Beach Hotel beach, and it's a July afternoon. So there was a crowd watching all of this performance go on, and they turned it into this ludicrous, farce. And it was just a kind of straightforward accident. So memory of the shoal seems to have somewhat disappeared, but Daniel Burnham knows about it, I think, because he comes up with this plan in 1909 as part of the giant plan of Chicago to turn the entire South Side into this recreation island structure from 55th Street to downtown. And we do get part of it. This is Northerly Island. Of course, that gets built. And it goes apparently right over the top of Morgan Shoal. And he dies in 1912. There's a whole committee forms to complete his plan. They're pushing all these different parts of it. And so the plan continues to build. This is the late 1920s. Late 1920s version of Photoshop. It's an aerial photo, and somebody's come along and drawn in the various islands. So you can see here that they're making, perhaps drawing in at this point, the promontory point. Oh, and part of his plan is to have a boulevard run along the shore. So one of the themes of Chicago history is along the lakefront is riparian rights. That is, who controls where the land meets the water. And the federal government controls any water that's navigable. They can hand the rights off to other people. There's also private property rights. And you may be familiar to the big court cases that came with Streeter and Streeterville. Apparently, they leave Morgan alone. And I suspect one reason they leave Morgan alone for building out all this land is he was, if not the richest man, one of the richest men in Chicago. He dies in 1898. His daughter inherits, and she sells it off to the new Chicago Beach Hotel. You can see how much more land they've built out. It's now various estimates, maybe 12 to 14 acres. And so they invest in, it's a very high end, it's got 18-hole putting green and tennis courts. And the South Parks Commission wants to build this boulevard that Burnham wanted between Jackson Park and Grant Park, which they both control. But so they're lining up all the riparian rights, but they can't get them from the Chicago Beach Hotel, which claims, well, it's our private beach. And how can you have a beach hotel if you don't have a beach? So they really, they take it to court, it gets all bogged down. And finally, the South Parks guys say, what if we build you a lot of land? And it's all yours. And, they said, no, okay. So that's why the lakeshore looks the way it does. This is the Burnham plan, Promontory Point. And this is, as you can see here, this is the Chicago Beach Hotel. This is them swinging out so they can give all this extra land to the Chicago Beach people as they work their way up the lakefront to build this road. So here's the road. So this is a view 1930 from the 39th Street Bridge south. And you can see one of the things the road does is, it's Burnham pictured bicycles and carriages. So this is cars. So it now is raising the question of access to the lakefront. How do you get to the lakefront if you've got this highway? The other thing that appears as a question at this time is the Army Corps of Engineers, because it's a 1930s law that gives them the responsibility to control the shorelines of all the Great Lakes, which of course are navigable, and so they're federal. And they don't have 51st Street Beach anymore, so they make Pebble Beach. And the way they, the way they did the landfill is wooden pilings, rubble, clay, sand, and then they rim it with the giant limestone revetment blocks. So the beach opens by 1931, and the Tribune loves in the early years to send photographers down and see pretty girls sitting on the rocks. But it had this long life, as a very popular beach. This is a photo of 1972 Kenwood High School kids. And the words are from the Tribune in 2008 saying that what really makes the beach special is this Mediterranean feel from the rocks. It was unique for the rocks. It was unique because the water, because of the shoal and the rocks, is deep there. So it's the only place where you're not wading way out on the sand. It also is deep enough. It was the only beach in the entire lakefront that had a diving board. So it had, for a time, a lifeguard, the diving board, the comfort station, and a little cutoff to get to a parking lot off the drive. So this did not, so the parks on the lakefront on the south side really suffered from Mayor Daley really wanting to use federal funds to build an expressway. So for 20 years, he keeps coming up with these plans to build an expressway down the lakefront. And Pebble Beach is actually left fairly alone in this battle. They sometimes actually, it's an advantage. The plan actually gives them more facilities. But what really kills people is it eliminates what we now know as Harold Washington Park. And of course, it slices and dices Jackson Park like crazy. The real problem, though, in terms of getting federal approval is he needs to go down Stony Island, and that just wipes out a big commercial district. So this is this ongoing battle between Daley and independent Hyde Park and the south side. So I think it leads to another problem, which is that there's a lot of profound neglect on the South Lakefront. The absence of the ability to access it, limited facilities, and very little expense given in terms of maintenance and taking care of it, until you get to 1998, when Blair came in, who's the renowned architecture critic for the Chicago Tribune, writes a series of articles saying, we should really treasure the lakefront. What about this? And in the next year, they hired consultants and come up with the Burnham Park framework plan. So this is why there's more attention given, in addition to, of course, the erosion and the fluctuating lake water. And there's one other question, though, with riparian rights that I want to end with, and that's the Potawatomi. So in 1900, Simon Pokagon, who's a Potawatomi, filed a lawsuit to say, we never ceded the riparian rights. So all of this landfill is Potawatomi land. And it went into the courts, got tossed out on a technicality because, of course, in 1900, they really weren't going to listen and let this go through. And then in 2016, John Lowe, who's a lawyer and a Potawatomi, writes this book about the history and talks about the rights and how he thinks this is untested law and, you know, may really have a case. And then in 2021, you have a nice website outlining the problem. So I did not start with a land acknowledgement statement, but I'm ending with one. So that's it. Let's stop share.
Wow, thank you so much for that. Just like historical framing. And what I'm thinking, just so we make sure that we have time for all the presenters. This is what I invite us to do. If folks have questions, put them in the chat. We'll try to keep track of them, and then we'll have space at the end for asking questions of all of our speakers. But yeah, there's just so many forces at play, you know, social, physical, natural. And with that segue, I want to turn it over to Phil, who's going to bring in the scientific perspective, and especially hope to hear a little bit about, you know, what is this shoal to begin with, in addition to all the cool biological marine things happening around it. So take it away, Phil.
Thank you. I will, let's see here. There we go. All right, everybody see that? Not working? So this is normally a 45-minute presentation that I cut down to 10 to 15. So I'm going to go kind of fast, and I'm going to apologize for that. But as it's already been said, there'll be time for questions later, and you can contact me even after today if you have particular questions about any of this. So I'm going to be coming at this from a biological, somewhat geological perspective about what is out there. Morgan Shoal is here. I'm going to guess that this audience already knows that. It's off the Kenwood Hyde Park neighborhoods. What sort of makes it unusual is most of the bottom of Lake Michigan is mud or sand, relatively flat, maybe some small rocks. And yet here at Morgan Shoal, there's this hard bedrock that's sort of sticking up from the bottom. And that's very odd. And more so, this bedrock is actually the compressed remains of a coral reef. And it may sound strange that Chicago actually has a coral reef, but the reason for that is because Chicago wasn't always where it is now. And what I mean by that is if you go back 425 million years, Chicago was actually down here, if you can see my pointer, south of the equator in a shallow tropical sea. And if we had a time machine and went to this shallow tropical sea hundreds of millions of years ago, it would look something like this. This is an exhibit at the Field Museum. And it's an ecosystem dominated by corals and sponges. There's things called trilobites down here and all kinds of other really cool, super weird critters swimming around this whole place. And this coral reef wasn't just here at Morgan Shoal. It's actually part of a much larger reef complex that stretches all across the Great Lakes region and even forms part of the escarpment over which Niagara Falls flows. So it was a really big complex. If you measure it from end to end, it's around 1,100 miles long. This is roughly equivalent to the same size of today's Great Barrier Reef off of Australia. So we're talking about a massive natural structure here. Probably the most famous spot of this reef complex in Chicago, or at least the best known, is actually Thornton Quarry. So this is south of Chicago. This is Interstate 80 right here, cutting right through the middle of it. This is also part of that same reef complex as Morgan Shoal and everything else that I've been showing that has been quarried out for building materials over the years. Although some of it now is part of water retention to reduce flooding and such. There is another spot if you are curious about it. So Morgan Shoal is up here. If you go past the Museum of Science and Industry, down here by Jackson Park Harbor, just south of the hospital area, there's a stretch of the same rock outcrop right here along the shoreline that you can walk over that's exposed. It looks something like this. And if you walk around and look around, you can actually see some of the fossilized imprints of corals and sponges out there. These are highly weathered because of the wind and rain and waves and all that sort of stuff. And there's no Tyrannosaurus rex fossils or anything else like there. They weren't around at this time. But you can find sponges and some other neat things out there possibly. Once again, they do tend to be highly weathered. Morgan Shoal is not very well known. Most of what people know about it is when the water levels are low, you can see the boiler is exposed. And even when the water levels are a little higher, you'll often see people out there swimming to it and taking a break or whatever. And you can see that the shoreline's over here. So this is just a few hundred yards off of shore, relatively close. And I should say that the shoal itself extends out for about a half mile or so. This is one of the closer sections to it right here, with Pebble Beach being kind of in this general area. And as Trish mentioned earlier, there's been a lot of plans for development over there. There's recent plans for development in this region. And about 10 years ago, people came to the realization that we don't know a whole lot about what's going out there from a scientific perspective. So I was tasked by the state to do a biological survey to see what's actually out there. So to do that, I put together a team of divers from Shed Aquarium, and they would go out there and we would swim around, collect data, do some surveys, collect samples of various things. This is the boiler, diver at the boiler. We would pick up, for example, we would pick up rocks, scrape everything that was off it, and then I would take these samples back to the lab and look at it under the microscope to see what was there. We used a drone, fly around to get aerial views over there, at least on calm days. You can see fairly well. We also use ROVs. These are remotely operated vehicles, basically little mini robots that are connected by a cable. And this cable is then connected to basically a suitcase with joysticks in it so that you can pilot this ROV around and record what you see. Here's a bass swimming by that the ROV sees. We even took school groups out there and let the kids pilot this around. So we kind of had floating classrooms checking all of this sort of stuff out. And the kids could pilot the ROV over Morgan Shoal. We also experimented with 360-degree cameras so that you could put those headsets on and kind of look around you to give an idea of what it was like to be out there without actually being out there. This was on YouTube at one time. I'm not sure if it still is or not. But most of the work was done with traditional nets and traps and that sort of thing, which is how we do most of our fish surveys. And we would set these out in all kinds of different places over the shoal and sort of different habitats to get an idea of what's potentially out there, what's living out there. The idea behind this was to survey everything that was out there, all kinds of plants and animals. There are not many plants at Morgan Shoal, but this is normal for along the shoreline. There's just too much wave action so that plants can't take root. They get ripped up during storms. So we don't really see them except in sheltered areas and harbors. So it wasn't a surprise to not see a lot of plants out there. But there is algae, which are technically different than plants. And you can sort of see that algae growing over these rocks in a relatively low levels there. And we looked at that too and identified those. This right here is a very cool organism. This is a freshwater sponge. This one's actually growing on the boiler. Most people think that sponges, live in saltwater in the ocean, and you'd be correct that the vast majority of them do. But there are examples of freshwater sponges. They're relatively rare in Lake Michigan, but we do find them there, and we find them in the Chicago River, and we found them at Morgan Shoal. So there's sponges out there. And kind of a cool thing is sponges are one of the first creatures at Morgan Shoal hundreds of millions of years ago, and we still have sponges there now. Probably the most common organism out there is this, and these are quagga mussels, which are close relatives to zebra mussels, and you've probably heard about zebra mussels. Ecologically, they're very similar, and in that they're invasive species. That's a whole story to themselves. They filter microscopic plants and animals out of the water, feed on those, compete with a lot of our native fishes and other organisms, and so on. I did not find many zebra mussels out there because quagga mussels have basically outcompeted zebra mussels in Lake Michigan. They can grow in very dense patches. You can see here's a patch of quagga mussels right here on the boiler. Let's see here. We also looked at all the other sort of smaller organisms out there. Each one of these is less than an inch long. You can call them aquatic insects, aquatic macroinvertebrates. They kind of go by different names. These are important because they're a critical part of the food web and the whole ecosystem functioning as a whole. So we looked at all this sort of stuff out here, and there's a lot of these out there, which means there's a lot of food out there for fishes and other things. There's crayfish out there. These can be several inches long. They kind of look like little small lobsters crawling around. So you get these bigger invertebrates walking around out there. And there's fishes out there. Probably the most common fish out there are these right here. These are called round gobies. This is another invasive species. They're competing with a lot of our native fish and having some negative impacts on some native fish, but they're also eaten by a lot of fish. These only get a few inches long. So larger fish like lake trout and walleye, bass, they love to eat these and seem to eat them in large numbers at times. So they're a part of the ecosystem now, but once again, an invasive species. The largest species of fish you're likely to come across at Morgan Shoal would be this. This is a Chinook salmon. They can be around 3 feet long. You won't see them there probably in the summer when water's warmer, but you can find them in the spring and the fall when temperatures are cooler. And of course, this is a popular sport fish. There's also coho salmon out there, rainbow trout, and some other salmonids. That's salmon trouts. Here's a smallmouth bass hanging out by the boiler. Actually, these are not very shy at all. Will often swim up to people if you're swimming out there. This is something called a freshwater drum. These actually eat quagga mussels, not enough to control their numbers, but they're cruising around out there. And this is actually a picture we took from an ROV. So our survey, the initial survey, I should say, was about a year, maybe 2 years. And during that time, we found 19 species of fish. And I should say that I've been out there since, and so we have seen more than what's up here. I should update this slide. We're around 21, 22 species of fish at Morgan Shoal. For comparison, the Illinois Natural History Survey actually created an artificial reef a couple miles from Morgan Shoal, farther offshore in deeper water. They surveyed that artificial reef for 15 years, and in that time, they caught 16 species. To see if this artificial reef was doing what they thought it could in attracting fish, they compared it to other spots sort of randomly picked out in Lake Michigan. And those random spots only had 15 species. So this artificial reef really didn't draw fish to it over time. But if you compare this, Morgan Shoal, a natural reef, actually has a higher biodiversity than what you find in a typical Lake Michigan spot or an artificial reef. So the question is, why is the biodiversity higher at Morgan Shoal as opposed to other spots? And to do that, we use something called a side scan sonar that can take pictures of the lake bottom. And we went out there in a boat and went back and forth and took all kinds of pictures of the bottom. You can compile these all together, and we basically make one giant picture of what's there. And I'm going to zoom in on one section here. And with this picture, you can actually see what the bottom composition is. Down here, this is sand. You can see there's ripples in the sand. These are small rocks. This is bedrock up here. We can see the bedrock cracking into larger boulders over here. And so now we have a good idea of what the habitat is like down on the lake bottom, and we can correlate that with what fish we find where. We also took depth readings over that as high precision depth readings. You can feed these into software like ArcGIS if you're familiar with that. And we built three-dimensional renderings of what the shoal looks like. So shore's over here near the top. This is farther out, and we can see there's like about a 15-foot drop right here. And then there's little channels and stuff like that and a lot of up and down on the shoal. And this helped us kind of put the scientific surveys into perspective. And sort of what the conclusion we came up with is that the reason there's a higher biodiversity at Morgan Shoal than you see in many other spots is because it's a very complex area. There's vertical surfaces, up and down surfaces, horizontal surfaces, sand, small rocks, big rocks, and then a lot of nooks and crannies in there, making a very complex environment with a lot of different types of habitats that can support a lot of different types of life, and particularly smaller ones, and then larger forms like fishes will then come to feed on those. So it sort of forms this whole ecosystem unto itself. You can basically think about this as an underwater city right off the shore of one of the largest cities in the United States. But as Trish mentioned earlier, I sort of showed Morgan Shoal is not the only shoal out there. There's some other shoals out there too as part of the complex. I've peeked at some of these. They're somewhat similar to Morgan Shoal, although Morgan Shoal tends to be larger and has a shipwreck on it and a number of other things and is closer to shore. If you're curious about this sort of stuff, there is a report out there that I wrote. It should be available on the internet. If you Google, you can find it. And I should mention that I've been there many times since writing this report, so we know more about it now, but this is a good place to start, and it provides a good baseline about what we knew about what's going on out there and what is out there. And so with that, since I'm not entirely sure how long I've talked and I want plenty of time for questions, if you have questions afterward, you can reach out to me. I forgot to put my email up here, but I did put my contact information in the chat as well, so feel free to contact me either through social media or through email. And with that, I will stop sharing and turn it over to Jim and the next speaker.
Wow. That is so cool. I know that's not very professional language, but I'm just going to say it was really, really cool to think that. I like the way the way you presented this is this huge underwater city, community, bustling situation right next to Chicago. And that something that I've been thinking about a lot at Friends of the Parks is how each section of the lakefront has its own story. This one is pretty cool though, with especially the biodiversity. And I just want to salute you for the work that you've done on this. Lots of questions that were coming up in my mind and other people's minds, but let's turn it over to Bill to bring us home. We've learned about the biology, the history. Let's learn a little bit about the people and the culture.
Okay, thank you. You can see my screen? Okay. Yeah, I hope I can live up to the standard of fascinatingness that has been set already. Very, very impressive. Just give me 1 second. I need to do one thing here. Sorry, one more second to get things in order. Okay, so yeah, the almost as unknown as as most people probably don't know about the diversity of aquatic life. Most people don't know much about the sort of cultural resource that lines Morgan Shoal. It's remarkable, although barely recognized. And it relates to the limestone blocks that Trish talked about, the revetments that were put in place starting about 100 years ago to protect the shoreline from the water. But those blocks have also been a place where people left a record of their life at the lake. And what I'm particularly interested in are the rock carvings that people have made on these rocks. At Morgan Shoal itself, along that stretch, there's about 1,100 rock carvings that I've documented there. They date back at least to 1930. And that's out of around 6,000 or more than 6,000 carvings that survive all along the lakefront. Plus thousands more that have been destroyed, which I'll get back to shortly. Just give me 1 second to make sure I got my cursor there. So, the lakefront, of course, is where millions of people hang out. This is where some people were hanging out in the 1950s. This is actually just south of Morgan Shoal and north of Promontory Point. It's now replaced with concrete and steel and is generally empty, certainly versus Promontory Point. But this is what Morgan Shoal would have looked like in its heyday, other than the Pebble Beach section, which is a little bit different. But the key point and why I'm here is to talk about what I think of as a social history, a spontaneous sort of collective social history that people left behind on these rocks. These rocks are right at 49th Street Beach. They're a little unusual because they were actually placed like paving stones, whereas most of the limestone along the lake is built up in the stepstones, which we'll see as well. But you know, I think of this as a spontaneous social history that people left behind of their life at the lakefront. And so the rock you see right there has many, many names carved on it. You know, you can easily see Mike and Chris and Ed, but there are many more. So this was a place where people, ordinary people, nearly all of them unknown, and you know, none of them, very few of them artists, left a legacy and left a little trace of their identity behind for us to see today. I call rocks like this one autograph rocks, where you have a whole bunch of different people hanging out and all adding their name to the rock. And there's actually a bunch of them, which we'll see shortly. But this map shows the distribution of carvings along Morgan Shoal. The numbers, these numbers are actually the number of rocks at each location, not the number of carvings. But you can see they're pretty much distributed all along. And generally the carvings concentrations reflect where people hung out. That's, you know, people hanging out and dug into the rocks and left something behind for us. So this is another view of the one at 49th Street Beach. You can see, if you look in the sort of right here, you see a big J. That's because that's part of, you know, one of these autograph rocks, of which there are a whole bunch right in that area, all sort of flat on the ground. I particularly like the one in the lower left here, Moogie Hearts, the Rainbow Rascals. But on that rock, you'll also find Pickles, as well as Zam, Addie, Iris, Jean, and others, all who left their names behind on that particular rock. But all these rocks just have many, many names, many people, you know, hanging out and leaving that trace of identity behind. This one's a little interesting just because it's Dave from the U.S. Army Air Force, which of course dates this rock to before 1947, when the Air Force separated from the Army. So this is probably a World War II era carving. There's lots, but you know, the carvings do go back to 1930, and they continue on almost to the present, as we'll see. So when I talk about the carvings to folks, one of the things that I like to talk about is the photographer Broussais, who was a photographer active in France. And in the 1930s, he documented rock carvings all around Paris. He took an interest in this particular type of graffiti. This is a composite of some of the photos he took. So these are just scattered all around Paris, and they're undoubtedly almost all gone, if any of them have survived at all, because I don't think there was much interest in them other than by this famous photographer who documented them. But there's this wonderful quote that he left us that really explains part of what I think makes the carvings that I'm talking about here so powerful. And particularly this idea that, you know, those who can't erect a pyramid or a cathedral to perpetuate their name, you know, the idea that these carvings, you know, are a reflection of this pulse of life and such intense emotion that it motivated them to forever inscribe their name into the rock, which I think is a wonderful description of this phenomenon and why it's something that really should be treasured, as opposed to destroyed, which we'll get to. So, like, you know, what led Bill Adler to do this wonderful typography at Morgan Shoal? I mean, I love the shapes of these letters in his name. One of my favorite carvings, my second favorite carving at Morgan Shoal, the favorite one is in my background, and we'll get a better look at that one. The lake is very calm when I took this picture, but of course, the lake is not always calm. And in fact, you can go back even before this 1917 newspaper headline to find year after year after year headlines about the storms that are tearing up the Chicago lakefront. 1917, here's one from 1929. Continuing on, of course, to the very recent past. This one is from 2020, when things were particularly bad. And of course, as I think Trish alluded to, the Chicago lakefront is not supposed to be there. It's not natural. It's almost all landfill, and what isn't landfill is pretty heavily engineered, which is why starting in the 1920s, the city laid these miles of limestone revetments along the lakefront from Indiana and into the 1940s all the way and 50s all the way up into Foster Beach. Now, the stones were laid there meant to fight erosion and floods, which they did for many years very effectively, but they had this other value as well, which is they provided access to the lake, because you can walk down these stones and you're right at the lakefront, or you're at a deck that is adjacent to the lakefront. And that goes into part of what is unique about Chicago, which is that we have a lakefront that was never industrialized, which is highly, highly unusual around the world. Most cities with waterfronts industrialized them in the 19th and 20th century for reasons having to do with riparian rights and so forth, and a lot of fluky things that did not happen in Chicago. So the fact that we have this parkland protected by these blocks meant that people could actually get to the lakefront, which is one requirement for these carvings to be made. And the other is that limestone happens to be an easy rock to carve, and it is durable, so the carvings tend to last. So people could get to the lake, and they could leave something behind. But the lake has taken its toll. The Morgan Shoal rocks were put in place, I'm pretty sure, in the late 1920s, certainly by 1930. So they've been there a long time. This is just an example of a usable checkerboard carved into the rocks at Morgan Shoal. And this is it in 2021. And you can sort of see the effect of the lake from, this was already somewhat deteriorated. That checkerboard, of course, is no longer playable because it's sitting vertically in the lake along with the rock that it sits on. It's now on its side. This is the oldest dated carving I found anywhere along the lakefront. So this is at 49th Street as well. So from June 1930. So there have been a long time for the damage to be done that's been done there. This is a fully dated rock from June 21st, 1931, in that same area. So people have been out there leaving something behind for a long, long time. It's almost 100 years now. And they left a lot behind. And they left stuff, more recently. So this is probably from the 1970s. You got Big D on the left and Carlos, and then the male-female symbols. That's still visible, easy to find. There are a lot of these bathing beauties along the lakefront. This is the long-legged one at, it's along Morgan Shoal. This is another one. It's like a little torso, if you look at that. There's a third one at Morgan Shoal, but it's too pornographic for this presentation, but you can find it on my website if you are so inclined, or in my book, Lakefront Anonymous. But bathing beauties are sort of a natural thing for people to sitting out at the lakefront to draw figures. This is an example of the issue with the conditions along Morgan Shoal. So this rock undoubtedly was once sitting in an orderly row of stepstones along the lakefront, but now Gordy and Lloyd and Zeke and Leo are stranded out in the water, or at least were when I took this picture, and askew. This is a sort of a charming message someone left. This is actually upside down now. I'm sure it wasn't when it was carved. There's another message from the same carver that is pretty much buried under a rock that it has fallen over it. I love this little carving. It's an Irish claddagh ring. And I'm pretty sure this is no longer visible. At least I haven't been able to find it. These are all, of course, from Morgan Shoal, that area. This is still visible. That's the tribute to Frank, which is, you can see, is pretty recent, 2010. On the lower left, there's a little incomplete peace sign, I should point out. I do like to tell people that along the lakefront, there are more peace signs than swastikas, which, I think is a happy thought. Lots and lots of peace signs. If anyone knows what Nitdu Daininu means, I'd love to know. I've not been able to decipher that one. Still visible. You can see it's in the Pebble Beach area from the Pebbles. This is a nice one, also still visible, although this one is now at a 45-degree angle. I think mostly due to the emergency repairs that were conducted a couple years ago at Morgan Shoal, which destroyed some, or at least buried some carvings. This one's still visible, but is vertical. On the left is what makes this rock so great. So someone carved, "He's watching you." Sort of charming in its way. Some more Morgan Shoal carvings. There's a hand on the left and a little profile on the right. That the hand is a little north of that Pebble Beach area, and the profile is just on the north east corner of that Pebble Beach area. Godzilla is south of Pebble Beach, probably a fairly recent carving, and the Native American on the right is north, a good deal, a block or so north of Pebble Beach. It's a little more of an adventure finding the Indian. Godzilla is easy to get to. Someone carved a Marine Corps eagle. I don't think they did a great job with that carving, but still, it was a nice thought. Here's another one of those hearts. Love the hearts with an arrow through them. There are dozens and dozens of hearts carved all up and down the Chicago lakefront. I should mention the carvings stretch from the Indiana state line up to Hollywood Avenue. This is another one that's dated. These are the most recent carvings that I found at Morgan Shoal. The bee and the flower, these are a little bit south of Pebble Beach. The bee and the flower are still visible. The cat head on the right, unfortunately, was not very deeply carved, so it's fading away. It's barely visible today. The most recent work of art, which we all know and love at this point, as was mentioned in the chat by Mae Maloney. This is from this year. Really a lovely work of mosaic. She also has a mosaic at Promontory Point, and there's some other beautiful recent mosaic work at Promontory Point. Of course, this is all threatened. We haven't really talked about too much about the city's plans, but the city has funded a project to rebuild the lakefront at Morgan Shoal. I think the condition of the lakefront there really requires rebuilding. The question is how it's going to be rebuilt and what's going to happen to these, to what's already there. Both the Pebble Beach question and the limestone blocks in their own way valuable, and then the carvings on them that make them more valuable. When the city conducted and the Army Corps of Engineers did lakefront protection projects elsewhere along the lakefront, thousands of carvings were lost and destroyed. The main reason is that these carvings have been barely known. They haven't really been on anyone's radar, at least until recently. I've had the good fortune to be able to bring them to the attention of both the Army Corps and the Park District and CDOT and the city. So at least there's some awareness. And when there has been awareness, there have been able to be saved. At least a few of them have been saved, and I'll talk about that in a minute as I wrap this up. But they're all threatened by this reconstruction, and it's not clear. And the advocates for Morgan Shoal, as they are acutely aware, it's been very hard to get input into this process and to be really certain about what the city has planned. Now, not all carvings at Morgan Shoal may justify, or the city might not be so interested in saving, even though I think Lancaster Eats Shit is kind of charming. But maybe that's not worth saving. But I'd argue that this is the one that's behind me. This is an absolutely elegant, beautiful carving by any standard. The typography and you would of course see that skull on any number of 18th, 17th century gravestones. Unfortunately, this one is half buried today. If you look in the middle there, you can kind of that rock jutting out towards the bottom center, you can kind of see Frank's wing. But Frank has this large block that's sitting on top of him, and then to varying degrees, there's rubble on top of Frank. So the point is that from the point of view of this cultural resource, it needs work. It needs work. If it's just left to its own devices, many of these carvings will be lost to the lake and its action. The question is how the city will proceed. Now, there are options that could include preserving and reusing some of the limestone. The top image here is from Fullerton Avenue. The bottom image is just north of Morgan Shoal, between Morgan Shoal and Oakwood Beach, where they repurposed blocks and created seating areas. And by design at Fullerton Avenue, they tried to find blocks that had carvings on them, so that seating area at the top on the lower left, on the bottom row toward the left, you see the carving that's on the top of this screen, what we call the hair washers. And then that rock sitting out in the middle of this circle on the bottom has this amazing carving on it, which I like to think of as the Three Stooges, plus maybe Shemp as well, and one of their antagonists. So it is possible to reuse the carvings. This is an example of the way limestone blocks were repurposed at the Belmont Rocks. The concrete and steel here is not exactly the first choice of many of us for our lakefront, but at least it gives access to the lakefront. And the blocks, and they did save about 250 of the blocks and that are used to line at the top of the concrete and steel. One thing I'll point out is the reason those blocks are there, and the reason why some of them have carvings and actually paintings on them, is because the alderman, Tom Tunney, actually took it on himself to go out there with a project manager for this reconstruction and told them, these are rocks I want you to save, because he thought that the art on these rocks had value and should be preserved. So there is, from my point of view, some hope of saving these rocks. They should be saved. The rock carvings along the Chicago lakefront are unique in the world, as far as I can tell. I don't think there's any other place in the world where you have a modern lakefront with modern carvings. There obviously are lots of ancient petroglyphs in different locations, but no city, as far as I know, has anything like these thousands of carvings that line the lakefront. And Morgan Shoal has some of the best of them. And my hope is that they will be, at least some of them will be preserved. But that's a whole new discussion about what should be done there, which maybe we'll get into a little bit. And so that's it. I can hand this back to Jen to lead the discussion.
Wow, thank you so much. Definitely makes me want to go out for a walk and look around a little bit more carefully.
I should mention that on Sunday, we're going to do a little walk to see the Morgan Shoal carvings on Sunday afternoon. So I think at 1:00, Betsy can correct me in the chat if I'm wrong. So we'll be meeting at the pedestrian overpass at 51st Street. And we'll take a look at some of them. It's a bit of an adventure because the pavement is so uneven and so broken up, but we'll see what we can see.
Awesome. So for those of you who are able to stick around for a little while longer, and this technically goes until 1:30, but I'm not closing the room right at 1:30. So anybody who wants to stick around longer, no pressure to the presenters, just FYI. But I want to do two things. First of all, I want to give some space to our intern, Edna Satiawan. She has been working with us all semester and it's been amazing. And she brings a global perspective to climate change, water, and our lakefronts. She has also been compiling the questions that folks have been asking in the chat, and so she can dump those back in to make sure we hit things. And I also, after she just introduces herself, I want to create some space for folks from Advocates for Morgan Shoal to give us an update on where things are. And also to maybe, for those of us who haven't been there, help us understand what the experience of being in that space as a lakefront user is like. So Egna, let me turn it to you, not away from you. So yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Let's see, pardon me for interrupting, Bill, if you can stop sharing your screen.
Oh, yes, I should do that.
No worries.
Unless you want me to show the map of what the plan is, but yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can pull that up later, but yeah, let's.
I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Egna, and I'm currently an intern at Friends of the Parks, and I'm interning as part of the Chicago semester program. And as Jin has mentioned, I'm an international student. My hometown is back in Jakarta, Indonesia, and for those who aren't sure where that is in Southeast Asia. It's an archipelago that is surrounded by the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So so the ocean, the beach, and just the water has been such a big source of life and also a big source of income for many coastal communities. And so I think issues such as erosion, rising sea level, climate change are all very pressing issues that I see throughout my life back at home. So yeah. And for the questions, I'll make sure to dump it in the chat again so everyone can probably review them.
Thank you so much, Egna. And while you're doing that, and yeah, Egna has been absolutely amazing. So, and I'm very excited to see, hope you can stick around in Chicago a little longer and share your gifts with us, and just very excited to see where you go in the future. So thank you for everything you've been doing. So while you do a little bit of that administrative work, I want to turn this over to, or not turn it over, but ask folks who are part of Advocates for Morgan Shoal to, raise your hand, chime in, and if anyone, I know Heather, you mentioned that you might be willing to speak a little bit. Give us a little bit of context for why this matters now. Like, what's going on with Morgan Shoal? What's gonna happen?
So since you named me specifically, but I will speak briefly so that if Betsy or Joy have something to say, I want to make sure they have space. So the city put forth a plan in 2015, the framework plan, and at the time had talked with some folks in the community, and here we are almost 10 years later, and Morgan Shoal has not been addressed under the previous shoreline project, and the city is getting ready to move forward on this project without community input. And there are many folks in the community that sort of have a vision of Morgan Shoal and Pebble Beach that doesn't entirely align with the 2015 framework plan. And we want to make sure that what happens on the shoreline represents what the community wants for our shoreline. So I'll end that and leave the space for Betsy or Joy if they want to speak.
Hi, I don't know if I'm visible. This is Betsy. Yeah, okay.
You're good.
Mensa. Many of us have looked at that framework plan that was created in 2015 with dismay because it appears, and I would love to see the map that Bill has, because what they have said they want to do is build out into the lake to create more parkland. Well, the way they do that, as we've seen over all the information we've gotten from Patricia and everyone, is that much of the land that we have now is landfill. And how will they build out without just covering everything that's there? We think that some of the rocks there are from the original limestone shoal, and it would be a great loss to lose all of that, plus the limestone that was put in place in 1925 or thereabouts, which has all the carvings and memories and records from people who have used the lakefront. So Advocates for Morgan Shoal has been created and is stepping up the efforts to collect some of those stories and get the community involved to demand more answers from the city about what they plan to do. Bill's point here about sloped stone revetment, you can see photos of what they mean. It's not passable, it's not accessible. This cuts our access to the lake. Are the only solutions a rubble mound versus concrete? There you see it. That is their image of what the lakefront should look like. I think we need to speak up to the city. And if you look at their websites, they're still showing that they would begin community engagement in the first quarter of 2023. So this was the Chicago Park District website. I checked it yesterday. So let's get together and continue this momentum. Thank you. Let me turn it over.
Yeah, so, and I'm gonna, because I want to make sure we have time for questions as well, and just like general questions, but just what sort of Betsy brings up, and I think is really important for us all to remember, and something that I've learned, especially working with Juanita, is how democracy is messy, and there's just so many different ways of approaching these questions. And what I have liked about working with Advocates for Morgan Shoal is that there's a recognition that yes, there's individuals might have hopes and dreams for the space, but that there's also a real commitment to say, well, hey, it's not just about us. What are other folks in the community interested in? Yes, the plan was made in 2015. What has changed? Who are the stakeholders who exist, who might not even know that they're stakeholders, and because there's many different paths towards creating an accessible lakefront. So I just want to, salute the Advocates for Morgan Shoal for asking a lot of really great questions. And with that, let's just see. We've got a lot of questions that have come into the chat. So let's see, there was a question about, we can just kind of go through on the native darters and the gobies. Phil, are you able to answer that question? If you scroll up a little bit, it says, are there still any native darters and sculpin out there, or have they all been displaced by the gobies? Is that how you say it, the gobies?
Gobies, yeah. Okay. I don't see the question, but I'll answer that. So darters are small fish, and sculpins. They're both native. They're only several inches long, about the same size as the gobies, but the gobies tend to be far more aggressive, looking for food and for places to lay their eggs. Once the gobies moved in, most of the sculpins in the shallow waters and darters disappeared. We did not find any darters or sculpins at Morgan Shoal, whereas 30 years ago we would have probably found them. The round gobies came in, 90s, I guess it was, early 90s. So no, they completely outcompeted them. But there's 4 species of sculpins, and I won't go on a too long tangent in here. There's 4 species of sculpins in Lake Michigan. Some of them are in very deep water, like hundreds of feet, and so they're still out there. It's the shallow ones that are competing with the round gobies, and they're taking a hard hit, and they're basically gone from Morgan Shoal now.
Actually, can you, what is so 2 questions. What is the significance of, it occurred to me, it's like, I don't even know what a native darter or a sculpin is. I might not be alone in not knowing about that. And so if you could just take like another minute or two to say, why does this question matter? Why do we care about these things? And my secondary question is, or just something that I'm thinking about is, when does the invasive become part of the fold, part of the ecosystem? Because I think that's something that you spoke to as well. It's like, well, these were invasive, but now they're playing another important role, and kind of hard to tease these apart, especially with the impacts of climate change. But can you just speak to why do we care about the darters and the sculpin?
Well, the darters and the sculpin mainly because they're a native part of the ecosystem. They're part of our natural heritage. They evolved here. They were part of it, and they're part of the ecosystem prior to the invasive species moving in. The mottled sculpin is actually now threatened in Illinois, partially because of the round goby and their impacts in the Lake Michigan population, but they're also susceptible to climate change and development and a number of other factors in inland rivers and stuff like that. Darters require healthy ecosystems to live, and when they disappear, that's usually a bad sign. It's typically due to habitat degradation and pollution and other factors. Their disappearance from Morgan Shoal and other areas along the Lake Michigan shoreline tends to be due to invasive species, which is a whole different story. Invasive species, you often hear, the bad invasive species, the good native species. And when I talk about this, I try to make it clear there's a tremendous amount of opinion surrounding these and what invasive actually means. For example, I showed a picture of a Chinook salmon, extremely popular sport fish, technically an invasive species. And yet we spend millions of dollars every year filling the Great Lakes with this invasive species because people like it, they like to catch it, and they like to eat it. And then we spend millions of dollars a year to get rid of sea lamprey, another invasive species, because we don't like it. So our opinions are all over the board. It's not very consistent, I should say, as to what people like and what people don't like, which makes the invasive species policy that much more difficult. And it's a lot of opinion. It really is a lot of opinion and PR and all these other types of things. And I'm not even talking about carps and stuff yet. So it's crazy. It can get really crazy.
Yeah. Thanks for elaborating on that. Another question in the chat is, how come we have I've wondered this too, how come we have a Pebble beach in this area? I know we have Pebble beaches around Lake Michigan, but not others in Chicago that I know of. So yeah, what exactly do we mean by the Pebble beach? It seems like, oh, it's a Pebble beach, but if anybody wants to just speak a little bit more towards that, because we've been talking about the shoal, but if anyone wants to tackle that question. So why do we have a Pebble beach in this area?
Well, I'll jump in, and
Right,
I'm going to tie this in with these plans that are being proposed along the lakefront as well, but not just along Morgan Shoal, but in other areas. Something that we need to learn a lot more about is how these currents work there, how the wave energy comes in from the lake, hits the wall, bounces back off the wall, comes back in. It's a very complex environment. And then tied in along with all of that is the movement of sediment transport. This is usually silt and sand, but pebbles can move too, as well as boulders during storms and all these other types of things. And we do know a lot about the general principles involved here with a lot of these things. But it would be good to get more information about how water moves around Morgan Shoal and how sediment moves around it. Because why is Morgan Shoal not covered by sand? And if we manipulate the shoreline, will Morgan Shoal become covered with sand? And so we need some studies to really look at what's going on before we change, in my opinion, before we change the shoreline to figure all of that out. Now, it was, Trish mentioned one thing, if you create a breakwater, and there's all kinds of these, or groins along there, we know that sediment collects on the northern side because the prevailing currents in Lake Michigan are from north to south, which is how the sediment moves. So you put up one of those sort of steel retaining walls that poke out into the lake, and they form a beach on the north side, whereas on the south side, it gets eroded away, but it's the sand that erodes first, and then you get left with the pebbles. So the reason Pebble Beach is there is because it's semi-sheltered, and there's enough water movement to sweep away the sand, but it leaves the pebbles. That's the short, simple answer. The more complex answer is, if you change the shoreline, will you still have a Pebble Beach? And I can't answer that question because these plans that I've seen from 10 years ago are artistic renderings. I don't know what the actual plans are. And so it's very hard to gauge whether Pebble Beach will be a beach in the future or a sand beach or no beach at all. And it would be really great to have more information about currents in that area and sediment transport to answer these questions.
I don't know if any folks saw whether you were at our presentation earlier this summer or have just been online. The department, the engineers working on the redefining the drive project, they created these huge models of currents and what happens to the lakefront to test out the reef or a beach. And it does make me wonder, I don't know, maybe the answer is out there, and I just don't know, what kind of modeling was done as part of the 2015 framework plan. So yeah, that's a really really great point. Let's see, I'm scrolling back up. I know other questions have come in. There are some specific questions about the carvings themselves, so they can be consolidated. But before we get to those, I'm just curious if there's anything that's just on in folks' minds about what we have been talking about that you want to chime in on. And then Bill, if you could scroll up in the chat a little bit, and then you can see what some of the questions were related to the carvings. Yeah. So yeah, what are folks thinking about? What do we want the future of the Morgan Shoal area to look like? What should we be thinking about?
You want me to go, or you want to see if anyone?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's for anybody. That's for anyone.
Yeah, I'll hold off until.
Yeah. And you can also just feel free to put in some. It's funny to put in some of your just any thoughts and observations you have in the chat. So no pressure. It's not a quiz or anything like that. So yeah, I mean, Bill, if you do want to.
I mean, there aren't too many. I mean, I answered one in the chat. Yeah, June 30 could very well be, and probably is more likely to be, a tribute to June that was carved in 1930, that rather than the month of June in 1930. Just goes to show how a fresh eye can help. Someone asked how you can tell how old the carving is. There are a number of carvings that are dated. And in fact, on my website, I have a specific page about dated carvings at Morgan Shoal and at Promontory Point that sort of lists out all the dated carvings. I mean, there's, if they're not dated, it's more of a surmise about how old the carving is. I mean, you can sometimes tell by weathering. At least you can tell when a carving is newer, because the weathering is definitely distinctive. But yeah, in many cases, it's guesswork, or it's based on things like, what does the typography look like? What kind of symbols? Like obviously peace symbols will date the carving to the 1960s. Swastikas are probably from the 1950s and 60s, and so on and so forth. But it's an art, not a science. The other question was which I'm not aware of the pile of limestones near the Steelworkers Park. I'd be curious to look at those. There used to be one of these limestone cemeteries right at 51st Street when you came off the pedestrian bridge, and there was at least one carving in those rocks that I documented, but I never had the gumption to climb the fence and walk and breach the fence and look at those. But those blocks have been removed to I don't know where. But I am curious about the ones further south. I'll have to take a look at those at some point. I think those were the questions about the carvings.
And then there was actually one more from Heather is, how did you get folks to listen to you? To say, hey, wait, this matters. What was...
Me?
Yeah, yeah.
I'd been interested in the carvings for a long time. Unfortunately, in many places, I only got really serious about it until they were lost, which is, of course, part of the normal human behavior is you ignore something until it's gone and then you value it. But I concluded a few years ago that maybe writing a book would be the way to bring some attention to the carvings, because really prior to that, there was almost no attention, with a couple of exceptions in the early 90s. There's almost no references in the public record to these rock carvings. So anyways, I wrote a book, published it, got a good deal of publicity. And I sent copies to people who I thought were in a position of authority, including to the Army Corps of Engineers project manager, who kindly actually responded, acknowledged receipt of the book, and shared it with some of his staff. And so I was in touch with the Army Corps folks, and God bless them, even though there's a lot to complain about in terms of historically what they've done on the lakefront. Although the city bears equal responsibility for that, and was able to get a meeting with them that was very well attended, including by representatives of the city as well. Now, that doesn't make me optimistic. These government institutions tend to prefer their own plans to other people's plans, but at least there's an awareness, and there has been some willingness, as I showed in some of these park district projects, to at least save some of the blocks. But obviously there's more at stake at Morgan Shoal than just the blocks. There's Pebble Beach, and there's the whole question of lakefront access. But I have been waiting anxiously, like the advocates have, for this community input process, which has yet to take place, even though in theory the project is going to begin this spring. So who knows?
And then building off of that, Phil, bouncing it back to you, Joy asked a question. Well, it's in the chat. I'm curious, is it the Reef? Or the Reef explains the seemingly larger numbers of red-breasted mergansers, coots, grebes. I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciations here. All these glorious divine ducks, and if studies have been done in terms of how a massive reconstruction project would affect them. Sorry, Joy, if I butchered your question there.
Yeah, no, I understand the question right there. I'm an amateur birder at best, so I'm not going to pretend I know a lot about birds. But I did notice that there were larger numbers of some birds out there. I think scaup was one of them that I saw. And no, I can't tell the difference between lesser and graders very easily when I'm out on a boat bouncing around. Yeah, there's two answers to that. One, it's semi-sheltered, so the waves may be a little smaller there depending upon the wind direction. And so the birds are going to, those various ones, the mergansers, coots, and grebes will kind of congregate there. But another factor is if any of these are diving ducks that dive down to look for food, whether it is mollusks or fishes or anything like that, it is shallower at Morgan Shoal. In some places, I mean, right now it's a little bit deeper than normal, but a few years ago, you could, maybe 10 years ago, you could actually walk around on parts of it. So these ducks would only have to dive down like 5 feet to hit the bottom and find food, as opposed to 20 feet, which they would have to elsewhere. So there's a concentration of food there for some of them, and they don't have to go down quite so far. And so that does concentrate some of these diving ducks in that area. So yes, but does the project impact that? The project probably won't make the lake deeper or shallower, so I don't know as that would impact it because of how it's there. But if the project changes the substrate so that there's less biodiversity, then yes, you would get less ducks as well, probably.
So as we are moving towards wrapping this up, and like I said, I'm not going to close the room, anytime soon, but I want to be respectful of people's time. I want to, zoom out a little bit to the work that Friends of the Parks is doing related to the lakefront in general. Yes, we're thinking about it in terms of small pieces. Every piece has its story, but then we do, have that promise of the open, clear, and free lakefront. Our vision of having the completed parks and paths system all the way up and down the lakefront, and what does that journey look like? And with the Army Corps revisiting, certain sections of, of the lakeshore, can we use different strategies to protect our shoreline? And maybe at Pebble Beach, sometimes when I think about nature-based solutions, I always go back to the word, soft edges. Morgan Shoal, maybe that's not going to be a soft edge. We got the Shoal. Shoal is hard. We've got the pebbles and the rocks. So, but how do we still ensure that there's access, and how do we ensure that what we do doesn't affect what is natural that we currently value? So one of the things Friends of the Parks has been doing this year is we've been giving out little seed grants to different groups, different efforts to lift up issues around lakeshore erosion along different parts of the lakefront. We've got some cool projects going on in Edgewater. I mentioned earlier, we had this really amazing event down by the confined disposal facility, which is another lakefront issue that was organized by the Birding Coalition and Kona School, lots of different stakeholders, also funded with a little micro seed grant. And Advocates for Morgan Shoal is also going to be receiving a seed grant to help with some organizing, community outreach, storytelling. And Bill, as you're saying, like, hey, I gave the book to the Army Corps, I'm sitting here thinking, well, I think there's going to be some really neat outreach events, art-driven events happening around Morgan Shoal. And so who knows, maybe some folks from the Army Corps will come to those events. So with that, I want to see if there's anything else on people's minds. We will post this recording. It does take a while for the recording to process, so it's not going to be right away. I will send out a follow-up email to folks. I'll try to do that before this weekend so that I can remind people about Bill's walk. If there's any other information that you want me to include in a follow-up email to those of you, to the folks in the Zoom, please let me know, and I'll tuck that into whatever email I send back out. So is there anything else on anybody's minds? Or Juanita, if you want to say anything? You good?
I guess I'll just give a little bit more update on the confined disposal facility. We do have a lawsuit against the Army Corps of Engineers that is active right now with us as co-plaintiffs with the Alliance of the Southeast and Environmental Law and Policy Center as our lawyers. The relationship with the Army Corps when it comes to Friends of the Parks is a little challenging right at the moment. We do stay in touch with the Chicago Park District about what the Army Corps is doing as it relates to their 3-year study of the lakefront, and can certainly talk to them a bit more about Morgan Shoal in our next meeting. But we have had quite a bit of success so far pushing back on the Army Corps' attempt to build an expansion of the existing pollution dump at the lakefront and the convergence of the Calumet River right on the edge of Calumet Park. There's lots of different pieces, as Jen has mentioned, along the lakefront, different strategies that we are also pursuing as we seek to complete the various parts of that lakefront path and park system. And, some folks have asked us, why are you involved in a pollution waste dump issue? You're Friends of the Parks. But that dump is right next to Calumet Park and was supposed to be turned into a park a long time ago. So we've, been hearing a lot behind the scenes from different actors about kind of the pressure that needs to be applied to the Army Corps to kind of help them be more forward-looking in the strategies for, how to address lakefront erosion. And we've been reading about kind of the recommendations that they've been making in other cities that are, coastal cities that are facing rising sea levels. And unfortunately, we're a bit dismayed about what we're hearing so far, which has a lot to do with building walls and less about nature-based solutions. So, we're looking for lots of strategies, and we're excited for community residents to be involved in asking questions and thinking about what it looks like to have a healthy lakefront moving forward. So thank you for participating with us today.
Thank you, Juanita. And I forgot to mention about last weekend's event. We had the Alliance of the Southeast and Environmental Law and Policy Center, who are also there, and of course, really critical to not just being partners, but for the lawsuit. So that was my omission. So thank you, Juanita, for filling that in and just sort of rounding out the conversation. And yeah, anything else? That's my dog barking. Although I know that she said, "Why haven't you been paying attention to me?" So, all right. Well, I'll stick around. I'll let folks wander off. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing this wonderful, beautiful, sunny afternoon with us. I hope you all get out to the lake, or at least some of you guys.